Years ago, must be 45 years ago, a fifth grade Sunday school teacher asked her students to write a note of encouragement to the preacher. And I've kept this note from Kenny Ward for 45 years. On the front, you can see he got to Bob Russell, misspelled my name, but he's got a platform with a stick figure standing in front of a microphone. On the inside, he wrote, "Mr. Russell, you have to be brave to be able to stand in front of thousands of people. I'm glad you're a preacher at this church. I think you do a wonderful job, but I'm praying that one of these times you don't mess up." Signed, Kenny Ward. Now that's a word of encouragement there. You know what I think? I think Kenny Ward was listening to his mom and dad on the way home from church. And they came to visit and they really liked it, but they'd heard all the bad reports about preachers in large churches messing up. And they're just saying, "I hope he doesn't mess up." And Kenny Ward says, "Mr. Russell, I hope you don't mess up." Well, if I had my life to live over again, I'd do many things the same way. I would decide in April of my senior year of high school to enter Bible college, and I would go to Cincinnati Bible College, and I would meet Judy K. Thomas and marry her, and a year later I'd take the ministry in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'd stay for 40 years, and I'd transition to Dave Stone. So I think I did some things the way God would have me to do them. But I got to tell you the truth, I messed up on some occasions too. I don't have a major scandal to my name, but I made mistakes, and I learned some lessons from those mistakes that have been impactful to me. Some of your best lessons in life are learned from your worst mistakes. Isn't that true in marriage? I hadn't been married very long. My wife and I are very different people. Even I'm a morning person. I feel great at 6:30 in the morning. She doesn't really get operating until about 10. But one morning early in our marriage, I got up, went downstairs, went out to get the paper, and 6 inches of fresh snow had just fallen, unpredicted. Nobody said it was coming. 6 inches, and the sun was shining, and this was wet snow, and it was glistening off the trees. It was an invigorating experience just to see it. And I thought, my wife needs to see this. And I got a brilliant idea. I reached down, and it was packing snow, and I made a snowball. And I went upstairs, and I crawled back in bed, and I leaned over and put the snowball on her stomach. I will never do that again. It was the only time in 59 years of marriage that she hit me. And she slugged me on the shoulder. She was not happy. You know, you learn from your stupid mistakes. It's not what to do. It's a wise person who learns from mistakes. It's a wiser person who learns from the mistakes of other people. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul documents the wandering in the wilderness and the rebellion and the grumbling. And then he says, these things happen to them as examples to keep you from falling into disobedience the way they did. And one day, 23,000 of them died. So I'm going to share with you some of the mistakes I made in ministry that taught me important lessons in hopes that it'll benefit you in whatever role you play in ministry. It doesn't have to be preaching ministry. I've got several of them. For one thing, I learned to confront disagreements when necessary. I learned to confront disagreement when necessary. One of the first mistakes I made early on in ministry was a failure to confront a staff person I needed to confront. Maybe it's because I wasn't properly trained in Bible college. My practical ministries course consisted in how to have a pictorial directory and how to run a vacation Bible school. It didn't talk much about leadership of a multiple staff. Maybe I didn't confront because I'm kind of naive and I believe all problems will eventually solve themselves if you just keep quiet about it. But let me tell you what it was. We grew to about 300 people, 250, 300, and churches were just beginning to have youth ministers, and our elders began to say, we need a youth minister. I said, I've got the right guy. He's a friend of mine I went to Bible college with. He's a year older than I am, and he's got a youth ministry in Georgia, and he's having some struggles, and I think he's movable. Well, those ought to be 3 strikes against you. Friend, year older, ministry's not going well. But we interviewed him, and he's a talented guy, good interview, everybody liked him. He came, we had some good times together, but he wasn't on staff very long before I discovered his philosophy of youth ministry was almost diametrically opposed to what I thought we needed. His philosophy, when he wanted to get a handful of young people and disciple and deepen them and not worry about all the others. My philosophy was we need to have a broad appeal to everybody. Well, the youth ministry didn't go very well, and the elders in elders meetings began to say, we may have to dismiss this guy. And I was always saying, no, don't do that. We'll work it out. It'll get better. Well, it didn't get better. And one day I read an article he had written to promote a teen all-nighter that they were going to have. The kids still have teen all-nighters. They have all-nighters. They're going to have an all-nighter at a bowling alley or something. And he wanted to put an ad for it or promotion in our church newsletter. And he entitled it, A Teenage Love-In. And I thought, in light of the hippie culture of that day, in light of the parents didn't, and when you have problems, eventually there's something that's a straw that breaks the camel's back. So I take this article, I march into his office, and I say, I think you need to find another title for this outing. He sensed the distancing in our relationship. He dug in his heels, and he said, I think I know how to lead teenagers. That's what we're going to call it. Now, I've got insubordination. And I then dump too much, too angrily, too late, and he doesn't respond well. And finally, I march out of his office saying, don't you know this is the kind of thing that could get you fired? Which is a violation of Leadership 101. He asked to be on the agenda of our next elders meeting, and he said to the elders, I think you guys need to know that I believe that Bob Russell's trying to get me fired. The elders all said, really? He said, we've been trying to get you fired for 6 months, and we've not been able to do it. He said, I'm not resigning. That's not what this church wants to be done. That's not what's best for these kids, and he marched out. That week, he wrote a letter to every member, 300 letters, saying, I've had a disagreement with Bob Russell and the elders. They've asked me to resign. I don't think that's what you want. I'm not going to burden you in this letter with all the problems, but my wife and I will be standing outside church next Sunday with a 10-page document showing you what the issues have been. Next Sunday, he and his wife stood outside church, passing out a 10-page document, quoting, misquoting me and the elders, putting us in the worst possible light. Our people are stunned because they think everything's been going well. They don't know that there's this turmoil going on inside. He conducted a Sunday school class. His Sunday school class began meeting in his home. After Sunday school, 20 of them would march to church, sit in the first 2 pews, fold their arms and scowl at me when I preached. And that was my baptism of fire in ministry. I came home one night during this, and there were 3 elders from a church in Cincinnati said, Bob, our preacher has retired, and we want to hire you as our preacher. Would you be willing to come to Cincinnati to be our preacher? I go to our elders, and I say, look, I know I'm at the center of this controversy. I have an offer to go elsewhere. I can resign and make it easier for, maybe better for the church if you think it's best. All 7 of the elders said, no, we want you to stay. We're going to work through this problem. I came home 2 nights later, and there was my first ever color television set sitting in the family room, and there was a note on it that said, this is a gift from the elders. We're not trying to bribe you, but we want you to know we love you, and we hope you stay. Well, they bribed me into staying, and I stayed, and we worked through that problem. But I was so angry at that youth minister who tried to split our church. Now, I tell you that story for 2 lesser reasons and 1 major reason. One lesser lesson is Every church has problems. You look at something like Southeast Christian Church, oh, wouldn't that be a preacher's dream? Well, every church has problems, no matter how good things are going. I tell people all the time, 95% of what's going on at Southeast Christian Church is wonderful. One of the best churches I've ever seen. 4% is not so hot. And 1% is nasty. And my problem as a leader, your problem as a leader, 50% of your time is focused on that 5% trying to correct it, and you lose the big picture. And you need to be able to step back and say, you know what, people are being saved here. Lives are being deepened here. Christ is exalted here. Let's keep the big picture. But every church has problems. It's not whether you have problems or not, it's whether how you go through. The second lesser lesson is when you have unity at the core, you can go through a lot. So when you have disunity at the core, then you got problems. All 7 elders are on the same page. They said, no, we want you to stay. And they stood firm. We got through that problem. When you have unity at the core, you can go through a lot. But the primary reason I'm telling that story is I was angry at that youth minister, but the further away I got from it, the more I realized this really wasn't his problem. It was my problem. I hadn't confronted him as a leader when necessary. I hadn't given him the parameters. I was afraid of losing a friend. I was afraid of confrontation. So when I came out of that, I became a different leader. I became a confrontational leader. And I learned some things about confrontation. I learned the importance of having weekly staff meetings in which discussion of issues was easier and natural. I learned the importance of regular evaluations in which input and tough questions were expected. Somebody said, you keep your accounts current. You don't let things build up over a period of time. I learned to wait a day or two before I confronted, because if I confronted in anger, I exaggerate the problem and wind up apologizing for overstating my case, and the correction is blurred in the emotion. You know what I'm talking about? You have a problem in your marriage and you explode, and then you come back later and say, I want to apologize for the way I did that. Okay, you're forgiven, but you never really get to the issue. And if I confront in anger, I'm not a good confronter. I also learned you don't have to confront everything. You just confront the things that are dangerous. A mentor of mine, John Wilson, used to say, when you have problems in your church, you got to decide whether you got measles or whether you got a malignancy. Measles, you just wait a while, it'll go away, it's no big deal. But if you got malignancy, you better confront early and precisely. I also learned that encouragement means a whole lot more if it's balanced by an occasional correction. You preachers know what it's like. Somebody comes out the door every week, good sermon, that's a good sermon, it's a good sermon, good sermon. Well, eventually it doesn't mean anything to you. But if a person comes out every maybe 6 months and says, you know, you said something in your sermon today I'm not sure I agree with. I wonder if we could talk about it. Then that person comes out a little later and says, boy, that was a great sermon today. Somehow it means more to you because you feel like they're being honest. And some people think they're an encourager because they're always telling you it's great, it's great, it's great. But you're more of an encourager if you're honest enough to confront when you disagree. I also learned that confrontation doesn't take nearly as much time and effort as we imagine. Do you know the name of Patrick Lencioni? Any of you? He's a business guru, written some books like The 5 Temptations of a CEO. We had a business leadership activity at our church. We brought in Patrick Lencioni, good speaker. He told about consulting with a particular business, and he learned that everybody on the ground floor, all the support staff, everybody was concerned because a vice president by the name of Fred, who wasn't very capable, was telling everybody that he'd been tagged by the CEO to be the next president, next CEO. And nobody had confidence in him. So the final day that he was there, Lencioni consulted with the CEO, and he said, do you know what Fred has been telling people? And the CEO said, I know. Fred's been telling people I've selected him to be my successor. But that's not true. I wouldn't turn it over to Fred. Fred couldn't do it. And Lencioni said to him, what are you going to do about it? And the CEO said, oh, I don't have the time and energy for silliness like that. And Lencioni said, how much time and energy would it be to pick up the phone and say, hey, Fred, this is the boss. I understand you've been telling people that you've been tagged to be my CEO. You know that's not true, and I better stop or something bad's going to happen to you. Have a good day. How long would that take? Not very long. Why don't we do that? We say we don't do it because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. The real reason we don't do it is that we're people pleasers and we don't want people to think badly of us. That's why the Bible says clearly, if any of you has something against your brother, go to him personally and work it out between the two of you. If he listens to you, you've won your brother over. And I really think 85% of the problems we have in church would be resolved if we just followed that passage. Rather than going to other people, complaining to our family, we just go and say, hey, we got to disagree. Something I want to talk about here. And we do it in love. Many times it can be resolved. Galatians 6:1 says, if a brother is overtaken in a fault, you who are spiritual, restore him gently. I learned the value of confronting. The second lesson I learned to acknowledge my weaknesses and delegate accordingly. I am going to confess to you, and I hate to do this with women in the audience. I'm going to confess to you my worst mistake ever in ministry. I forgot a wedding. I never confess that and have a preacher tell me, I'll tell you something worse I did. No, that's about the worst thing you can do. I forgot a wedding. I have all kind of excuses about why I forgot a wedding. The rehearsal was on Thursday night instead of Friday, and the wedding was on Saturday. I had 2 weddings on the same day. My secretary was not in the office to remind me. But the bottom line is, I forgot the all-important date on this couple's calendar. I woke up on Saturday morning and I said to my wife, I don't think I have anything until that wedding tonight. I'm going to take my 2 boys. We're going to go to the neighbor's Little League baseball game. Now this is long before cell phones. So I took my boys to the baseball game. I come strolling back in at 1:30, and my wife meets me at the door in a panic. She said, did you forget that you had a wedding at 1 o'clock? Oh, my heart sank. I suddenly remembered. She said, well, they got an associate minister to do it. Well, it was really our old janitor who had a ministerial degree, and he performed a wedding. It couldn't be any worse. I was so sick. I said, well, the first thing I got to do, I got to go apologize to that family. They're up at church right now getting pictures taken. It's a 10-minute drive to church, but you would not believe the lies that came to my mind. I have stopped by a train. I had a flat tire. I saw a vision of a 70-foot high Jesus. I've been in a trance. I imagine I'm going to go in the sanctuary and the couple's going to be up front. And I go in the sanctuary, the whole family's up front, and someone saw me in the back. Oh, the bride said, oh, Brother Bob, we're so thankful you're okay. We thought maybe you're in an accident or something. What happened? And it took every ounce of, easy for you to laugh, every ounce of integrity I had to say, I am so sorry, I just forgot. Will you forgive me? And to their credit, they forgave me, which means they didn't shoot me. But that whole weekend, I was so down on myself. I said, I don't belong in ministry, especially this ministry. It's way out of control, and I should just quit. I can't even administrate my own schedule. And so I said, I realized at that point, if I am going to stay in this expanding ministry, I have got to make adjustments. I am ashamed to tell you that year I did 32 weddings. 32 weekends. That is a people pleaser out of control. So I took my calendar on Monday. I remember I just dropped it on my secretary's desk and I said, I want you to run my life. I'm out of control. Here are the times that I'll see people. If somebody asks me to do something, I'm going to say I'd love to, but my secretary runs my life, call her. And she said, well, in the first place, you're seeing too many people, we're going to cut that back. I said, I'm just going to do 15 weddings next year, first come, first serve. Somebody else asked me, channel them to the associates. And then we arranged for her, she got a little committee to evaluate requests that I had to speak or to go to a class meeting, and she would say to people no. And then on Friday, when she left the office, she would call my wife, who is strong on administration, and on Saturday when I got up to shave, I'd look in the mirror, and there's a Post-it note on the mirror of what I'm going to do on Saturday. Now I know you're probably thinking, how in the world could the Lord use such a goof-off as Bob Russell to minister to a church of 18,000 people? I'm telling you, this is how. I admitted I'm not good in this area. I've got to have people around me who are strong administrative types. And I turned it over to them. And all of a sudden I began to discover I had more margin in my life. I had some free weekends. I wasn't last minute or missing appointments. And it's just been incredible what happened to me because I said I am weak in administrating my own time. I'm going to have somebody, a secretary, administrative assistant, who will schedule my activities. It's not easy. About a year later, I'm walking through the church building on Saturday morning. Custodian setting up for a wedding. I said, somebody getting married today? Yeah, who is it? And when he told me who it was, my heart sank because it was a daughter of a family I'm really close to. So I went to the secretary on Monday and I said, look, I said 15 weddings, but when somebody like that asks for me, make an exception. She said, they didn't ask for you. Yeah. Now, you can smile at that, but you guys in ministry know that's hard to swallow because you like to be in control. You like to be at the center of things. You like to be needed. And I really think that problems we get into in leadership are the result of ego. We don't want to release things. But when we're willing to admit weaknesses and release responsibilities to others, ministry becomes easier and leadership becomes more effective. So delegate even if it hurts your ego. Delegate in the area of your weakness and stay in the area of your strength. The longer you are at a position, the more you should be doing things that you like doing, and the things that are hard for you to do, somebody else is doing. I tell people all the time, you don't have to take a gifts test for me to tell you where you're primarily gifted. You just tell me, what do you do when you do it, time flies for you? You put me in a room by myself. I'm a little bit of an introvert, and time to study for a sermon. I start at 8 o'clock, and I look up, oh, it's 11 o'clock already. I've only got an hour left. You put me in a marriage counseling session, 10 minutes into it, I'm saying, oh, they expect this thing to go on for 45 minutes. I'm just dying. Because that's not where I'm gifted. So, the longer I'm in ministry, the less marriage counseling I should do, and I'm not very good at it, and the more study I should do for sermons. That's the only way you survive. In a long ministry, you start delegating. And you delegate in the area of your weakness. And delegate and don't micromanage. Really hard. Staff people sitting here will tell you they will do a better job if they're given the parameters and then they have freedom to use their creativity than if they've got to do it just exactly the way you have it planned out. To be able to delegate and not micromanage. And delegate to gifted people and help them look good. Your job is to make those staff people, those people under you, those volunteers, you make them look good and you encourage them. I really think the reason most churches don't grow beyond 100 or 150 is this failure of delegation. If you're a hustler, you're ambitious in ministry, you can be the personal chaplain to about 100, 150 people. But beyond that, you can't see the church as a pyramid with one guy at the top meeting everybody's needs, or the pyramid's only going to be so large. You got to envision the church as a circle where you train people to minister to each other. And if they're ministering to each other, they're going to be happier and more involved, and there's no end to the size of that circle and still be effective. People say, how could you have an effective 18,000? How can you be a church 18,000 people? Well, the church isn't built on one person. We're ministering to each other. The best shepherding program is involvement. If people are involved, they're likely to come back. And if they're involved in helping each other in some area or another, they're going to be strengthened. The Apostle Paul said, God gave some to be apostles, some to be pastors, some to be teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service, so that the body of Christ will be built up and will all be mature. The job of the preacher, the job of you in staff people, is not to do the job yourself, but to train volunteers, train people in the church to do the work of ministry. That's when you're most effective. Now, it takes longer to find those capable. It's easier to do it yourself. It's like if you've got a little child and your little child comes to you and says, tie my shoe. You stop and tie the shoe. Tie my shoe, tie my shoe. Eventually you're going to stop, take time, and teach that child to tie the shoe. Then you can go on. There's another level of leadership, is when you've got a 13-year-old child and a little child saying, tie my shoe, and you say to your 13-year-old daughter, would you come teach him how to tie your shoe? And then you go on. But that's delegation. But where this breaks down is, again, in this elder-preacher relationship. I came to our elders and I said, I need some help. I'm too busy. And they began to say, why don't you quit marriage counseling? Why don't you quit preaching on Sunday? And one of them said, Bob, how often do you go to the hospital? I said, well, I go to the hospital 3 times a week. We got a lot of people in the hospital. They said, well, you're going to the hospital too much. Tell you what, they said, we'll organize and we'll get people in the church with mercy gifts and we'll train them. We'll have somebody in the hospital to visit everybody every day, read scripture, have prayer with them. You just go visit people in the hospital who are terminally ill. So I announced to the church, hey, we love church growing. We love what's going on here. But I can't be personal chaplain with everybody anymore. There people said, yeah, we know you can't. But I said, so the elders, I blame the elders for a lot of things. The elders have asked me not to go to the hospital unless you're terminally ill. So if you're in the hospital, you don't want to see me coming because I'm not friendly face. I went to the hospital after that. I went to see a guy who's terminally ill. And this guy was in the hallway. He just had a minor operation. He's standing out there with his robe, and he saw me. He goes, you're not coming to see me, are you? He said, no. That works out okay. We had somebody in the hospital, best ministry, best shepherding programs involvement. These people love going to the hospital. But here's what happens. Mrs. Langley, between first service and second service, comes to one of the elders and said, I was in the hospital for 6 days and Brother Russell never came to visit me. That elder says, oh, Mrs. Langley, I'm sorry. Brother Bob usually cares for people. I'll talk to him about it. So he comes to me between services. Mrs. Langley's a little upset. She was in the hospital. You didn't visit her. Here's her phone number. I think if you just give her a phone call, it'll smooth it over. Now, that's on my mind, second service, when I'm going to preach. That's not what the elder should do. He's got to have my back. He's got, Mrs. Langley, remember we said the church is not a pyramid, where it's a circle where we minister to each other. Did somebody from the church call you, visit you? Yeah, there's somebody from the church there. Were you terminally ill? Looks like you weren't. You're back here at church. So, no, I'm not terminally. Well, sit down and shut up then. Maybe not that brazen, but you know what I'm talking about, okay? There's got to be this spirit of cooperation. Everybody can buy in. But sometimes we get in trouble because we preachers don't communicate to people what they can expect of us. But I learned to delegate and in the area of my weakness. Third lesson, it's got 4. I learned to give my family priority over the church. I'm going to tell you, I think one of the best things you can do as a leader in the church is to model marriage for people. Families are falling apart, and if people come to your church and they see husbands and wives who really love each other and families are together, I think the church would be so attractive you couldn't keep people away. But When I first came to Southeast Christian Church, 22 years old, I grew up in the country. This church is in the city. I had a BA degree from Bible college. This church is full of people with doctorates. I came from a church of 50. This church is already well over 100 and had a potential to grow large. I knew if I'm going to make it here, I'm going to have to hustle. I'm going to have to be focused. So I'm totally focused on the church. I have the greatest wife in the world. I neglect her. I take her to church and forget about her till it's time to go. I'd sometimes at the end of church service, I'd ask her to sit and wait in the car while I counsel with somebody. I'd bring work home and I'm not really home. I'm talked out, I'm ragged out. I come home and lay down, I just want to veg out. I don't have any more words. I'd let the phone call interrupt us. I'm so thankful for a wife who tolerated that and put up with me. A lot of things happened to jar me out of that. One thing was, one evening, I got a phone call. I was home, and I got a phone call from my wife telling me that she was going to be late coming home. They had some kind of issue where she was working. And I answered the phone so late that the answering machine kicked on and recorded our conversation. Remember the old home phone? It recorded conversation. About 10 minutes later, look, the red light's on. I want to listen, and I had to listen to my conversation with my wife, and I couldn't get over the lilt and the energy in her voice and the deadness in mine. The conversation went something like, Bob, you having a good day? Okay. Well, what are you doing? Reading newspaper. Well, I just called to tell you I'm going to be late coming home. We got hung. Okay. Well, do you want me to bring something home to eat? You want to go out to eat? What do you want to do? Doesn't matter. I listened to that and I thought, I just read a chapter in a book by Bruce Larson, and the chapter was, are you fun to live with? I said, I'm not fun to live with. If I die, I want Judy to shed at least one tear. She's going to be happy that I'm gone. I knew in my heart that if that had been the average person in the church called me, I'd have said, oh, having a good day. How's yours going? I'm reading the newspaper, reading an article about U of L football. Have you read that? I'll read it. No, don't hurry home. Just take your time. But to my wife, person who mattered most, said, yeah, no. And I made a conscientious effort, that's going to change. And I learned to shift gears. I walked away from church 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon and said, Lord, that's the best I can do. I got some things I'm behind on tomorrow morning. I'm not taking anything home. I'd drive in the driveway, I shift gears. I've got a friend, Ben Merrill, that used to say he pounded a nail in the door between the garage and his house. Everybody thought that was to hang a hat. He said, no, that's where I symbolically hung all the junk that happened during the course of the day. So I started, even though I was tired, being more energetic, trying to be more humorous, more engaged, listen better at home. And you know what? We had a good marriage and it started getting better and better. Not too long after that, my wife and I were in the kitchen at church serving pizza to about 12 teenagers. And Judy was serving pizza, and I looked at her, and she looked particularly attractive to me at that, and I winked at her. And she looked away like she was embarrassed. About an hour and a half later, I'm sitting in my easy chair at home. She came up behind me and put her arm around my neck and kissed me on the back of the neck. She said, you know what that does to me when you wink at me in public? I said, no, but I found out and I'm going to do it again. I think the best thing that the preacher can do for his family, staff people can do for the church, is to love their family and set an example for people. Okay, the last lesson I learned to be content regardless of statistics. This is a lesson most of us know in our head, but it takes a while to make its way into our heart. I am a competitive person by nature. I like to win. I play sports, I like to win. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's ambition. You want things to be right. You want things to be good. We ought to be driven people if we're serving Jesus Christ. Paul Harvey used to say it's each tree striving for a place in the sun that makes them all grow tall. However, ambition out of control can be the seedbed of discontent and jealousy and compulsive behavior in church work. Early on in ministry, my mood would be dictated all week long primarily by whether attendance was good on Sunday or the offerings were up or something. And no matter how good things were, it was never enough. Today's home run is tomorrow's triple. There's all this encore mentality. I love that passage of scripture in Philippians where Paul said, I've learned the secret of being content. Whatever the circumstances, I've learned to be content. So contentment is learned behavior. I cannot point to a single dramatic event where I said, okay, attendance doesn't matter anymore. It still matters. I think it's important to count as long as we're comparing ourselves with what we did a year ago and evaluating honestly what's going on. But I got to the point where my contentment in ministry was no longer determined by the number of people sitting in the seats or the offering. I never lost my zeal for evangelism. I never lost my zeal for the love for the church. But I reached the point where I could say with Paul, I'm content regardless of the circumstance. Have you ever seen that picture of the Alaskan sled dogs? You know what I'm talking about? The picture is taken from the vantage point of the driver, and you're just looking at the back end of the dogs going through this. And the inscription reads, if you're not the lead dog, the scenery never changes. Is that you? You got to be first. Somebody else does better and you're jealous of it. Can't be in ministry. You reach the point where you say, you know, I'm going to bloom where I'm planted. I'm going to make the best of what God has given to me. I've got 5 reasons here why you can be content regardless of statistics. Number 1, everybody hits an occasional plateau. Don't panic. Everybody hits an occasional plateau. Don't panic. Your situation's not growing. Numbers aren't up. Jim Collins in his book, I think Good to Great, talks about mountain climbers. They establish a base camp where the stragglers can catch up and the advanced scouts go on ahead and come back. Every business hits a plateau. Every church hits a plateau. It's healthy for you sometimes to regain your energy. Another reason you don't get uptight about numbers, numerical growth is mostly beyond your control. Take it from time. I've observed this. Southeast Christian Church, there are so many factors why we grew. Location, harmony in the church, competition from other churches, leadership in the church. There are so many factors that I don't control. Jesus said some seed is going to fall on hard soil. Some seed is going to fall on shallow. Some seed is going to fall on good soil. Even there, 30, 60, 100-fold. So a lot of things you can't control. It's not dependent on the sower, it's dependent on the receptivity of the soil. Thirdly, you don't get panicky because most people you're trying to impress really don't care about you anyway. I'm telling you the truth, okay? Who are you trying to impress? Why do you get all uptight if you're not the lead dog? Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes 4, there was a man all alone, he had neither son nor brother, and there was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked. Why am I depriving myself of judgment? This is meaningless. The people who really love you, the people you matter to, don't judge you by whether your attendance is 10% more than last year. My grandchildren could care less whether I preached in a church of 18 or 18,000. They just want to know, well, I get down and play the Wii with them. Well, I jump in the pool with them. And I'll tell you what, the people who love you most, the people who you're important to, that's not how they evaluate you. Fourthly, the appetite for more is insatiable. You're never satisfied. You get our church back years ago. One day I saw in a national religious magazine, Southeast Christian Church was listed as the 6th fastest growing church in America. I got a real ego boost out of that for about 10 minutes. Then you know what I started thinking? Who are the other 5? Are they telling the truth? Can we get ahead of them? And that's just silly. You're chasing after something and you're never satisfied. And mostly, God evaluates your ministry not by statistics, but by faithfulness. When you stand before God, He's going to say, were you faithful? I know what kind of soil you sowed on, but did you faithfully sow the seed? Eugene Peterson had a sermon, Along Obedience in the Same Direction. That's what faithfulness is. John the Baptist's numbers went down the second year. Big time. And Jesus didn't say, boy, I'm really disappointed in John the Baptist. His numbers down. No, Jesus said, no greater man born to woman than John the Baptist. And again, I'm coming back to the same theme. You're called to faithfully preach the gospel to the best of your ability, or faithfully serve in a department in the church to the best of your ability, and you just got to trust God for the results. And trust Him that His word won't return empty. I'm going to close out by showing you an example of faithfulness and what I'm talking about. This is a picture of my home church, First Christian Church, Meadville, Pennsylvania. This picture from 1941. You've all got these black and white pictures in your album. And this is a pretty sorry looking bunch of people. Take it easy. Anybody know where Meadville, Pennsylvania is? Meadville, Pennsylvania is about 40 miles south of Lake Erie. I think it gets the third highest snowfall of any city in America because of lake effect snow, and it's a depressed area. I showed this picture to a group of preachers, and a preacher said, I grew up in Meadville. He said, I was in the 8th grade before I discovered the Lord's Prayer was not, deliver us from Meadville. And this is the kind of church that people trash. I get upset with preachers who trash the church they grew up in. Always critical of their home church, how legalistic, how bad it was. I say, was that bad? How'd you ever get saved? So I don't trash this church. I want to tell you about the influence of some of these people who are faithful. And you look at this and say, what kind of influence could these people have on anybody? Well, on the front row here is Sue Anderson. Let's go to the next picture. She was our church organist. Salt of the earth lady. She's married to this guy over here, next picture, Homer Anderson. Homer Anderson was a mailman. They may have been having a little marital problem this day. I'm not sure what the issue was there. But they faithfully came to church. They had a daughter named Donna Cole now, a contemporary of mine. Donna Cole became an executive with Team Expansion, which is a missionary organization sending out missionaries all over the world. Her daughter's a missionary to Ukraine. And her son, Tim Cole, has been in charge of Waypoint Ministries, which is establishing new churches in the state of Virginia for the last 20 years. He's done a spectacular job. A lot of people know Tim Cole, Waypoint Ministries. On the far right is a guy named Stanley Betray. Next picture. Stanley Betray, married, next picture, this little girl right here in the front row, Mabel Betray. Now this is taken 1941, prior to Pearl Harbor. After World War II, Stanley and Mabel Betray felt led of God to take the gospel to Japan. And they spent 30-some years in Tokyo, Japan. There are Japanese people in heaven today because of First Christian Church, Meadville, Pennsylvania. In the middle are Edgar and Eva Pressey. Next slide. Let me just say, those two old-time names, Edna and Eva and Edgar. Now, they're not very glamorous people. They're not the kind of people you want to go on a vacation with, but they're faithful. You see the little baby that Edna's holding there? His name is Arnold Pressey. Arnold Pressey is today still a preacher in North Carolina. But when he was a little kid, his parents knew nothing about discipline, and he was a holy terror. People in the church say, he's going to burn this church down. That kid is out of control. My dad taught Arnold Pressey in the 5th grade, and on the way home, he'd often say, Arnold Pressey, he's going to wind up in the penitentiary. He's a preacher in North Carolina today. Now, he races race cars, and he does but he reaches people nobody else can reach. On the back row is Charles Ward. Next slide. Charles Ward, if you can see, he's got kind of a stern expression. He's a stern elder, legalistic guy. Everybody's a little afraid of him. Charles Ward had a daughter, Dorothy Haddenham, who became a missionary to Anchorage, Alaska. He's got 3 grandsons in ministry. On the front row right here are my mother and dad. My mother and dad are holding my older sister, Roseanne, one of 6 children that they eventually had. Roseanne never married, but she was kind of the Beth Moore of our church and our whole area. She'd teach the Bible all over. She was a registrar at Cincinnati Bible College for a while. And with my mom, I wish you could have known my dad. My dad was the 17th child of 18 kids. And his mother died when he was 3. His dad was a coal miner, an alcoholic, a womanizer, not a good man. My dad did not grow up in a Christian family. He grew up in a very dysfunctional family, tossed about from older sister to older sister. When my dad is 19 years old, he meets my mother, who is a Christian, and he gives his life to Christ. And I mean, he never looks back. He is totally sold out for Jesus Christ. He takes a job at the Talon Zipper factory in Meadville, Pennsylvania, working on the assembly line, a blue-collar job, and scraping to get by with 6 kids. But every week, 1/10 of his income is written to First Christian Church, Meadville, Pennsylvania. When I'm in the 6th grade, my parents decided they wanted to join with a few other families and start a new church in the little town where we lived, because we were driving 15 miles to church. And so with the help of First Christian Church, Meadville, Pennsylvania, they started the church in Conneautville, Pennsylvania with 35 people. And my dad loved that church. First one there, last one to leave. One of our early preachers skipped town, leaving a lot of unpaid bills. And my dad was really hurt. And he was concerned our church was going to have a bad reputation in Conneautville because everybody knows the preacher left with unpaid bills. So my dad went to the bank and borrowed $2,500 on his own signature in 1959. And he paid off personally all the preacher's bills, and then he took a second job working in a sawmill to pay it back. Now, when you got a dad like that, you're going straight into ministry, whether you want to go or not. And so, I become a preacher, my brother becomes a preacher, I've got 2 sisters married to preachers. I do have one sister who's a black sheep. She married an elder. You got people in your family you're a little ashamed of. My parents have 6 grandsons in ministry, and I think now 2 great-grandsons in ministry. On the back row is D.P. Schaefer, the preacher. D.P. Schaefer's son, Raymond Schaefer, became the 2-term governor of the state of Pennsylvania. You drive up I-79 from Pittsburgh to Erie, you'll see a section, Raymond Schaefer Highway. Raymond Schaefer would have been president of the United States. He served on President Nixon's cabinet. And when Spiro Agnew resigned, Nixon offered the vice presidency to Raymond Schaefer, and Schaefer said, no, the vice presidency isn't worth anything. I don't want that. And so he gave it to Gerald Ford. And when Gerald Ford becomes president. That's D.P. Schaefer's son. Many of you in a Christian church heard the name of P.H. Welshamer. Maybe not. P.H. Welshamer was a preacher of a mega church in Canton, Ohio, 2.5 hours down the road, contemporary of D.P. Schaefer. Nobody hears D.P. Schaefer. In fact, not long after this picture was taken, they asked D.P. Schaefer to resign because nothing was happening in the church. But look at the influence of this church 80 years later. Virginia, Japan, Louisville, Kentucky, Princeton, Kentucky. I wouldn't be in this. I can't look at D.P. Schaefer without getting tears in my eyes. See that guy right there? He converted my dad. You better not say anything bad about D.P. Schaefer to my mother. It hadn't been for D.P. Schaefer. People say it's a great church. Well, pretty average church, never grew beyond 180 people. But he just faithfully sowed the seed of the gospel. And my question for you is, 80 years from now, when somebody looks at a picture of your church, when they're going to point to you and say, hey, my children, I want a little child. this woman's children's director, she taught me about Jesus. Or this woman, part of my small group, that's my preacher, he preached the gospel, and that's why I'm a Christian today. That's why we're going to heaven today. Made all the difference in the world. And my challenge to you, regardless of where you serve, don't grow weary in doing good. In due season, you reap a harvest if you don't give up.